Thousands of people had come to watch Annie Oakley, to see her legendary performance. But when Annie stood on stage, her hands began to shake, and everyone would see the legend was ending. The audience was applauding. Annie tried to smile, but inside, she knew tonight everything would change. Annie Oakley was the world's best sharpshooter. She hadn't missed since she was 15. For 30 years, she had been perfect. She was the star of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Every night, thousands would watch her. She would make impossible shots and enchant everyone. Into the center of a card from 100 meters, the apple above someone's head, rapidly spinning targets. She would hit them all in a single shot. Annie Oakley meant perfection. Failure was not in her vocabulary. Until that day. But now she was 45 years old, and her body was beginning to age. The first symptoms began during morning rehearsal. Annie was making her routine shot, the target 50 meters away. She raised her gun. She took aim, but her hand trembled slightly. The bullet found the target, but not the center. It hit the edge. Annie was shocked. Concentration problem, she murmured. She tried to comfort herself, but the same thing happened on the second shot. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Annie didn't tell her husband, Frank Butler, anything. She told no one because she was afraid. Was hand trembling a sign of aging? Or was it an illness? Or just a temporary condition? Annie hoped this was temporary because shooting was her life, her identity. Being Annie Oakley meant making perfect shots. She knew nothing else. That evening there was a big show. Buffalo Bill had announced it. The legendary Annie Oakley. 3,000 people in the audience. Journalists. Important people. Annie's performance was always the same. 10 different shots. All impossible. All perfect. But this time her hands were shaking, and Annie knew. If she made one mistake, the legend would end. Annie did her usual preparation. She cleaned her guns. She checked her bullets. She put on her costume. But her hands were still shaking. Slightly, but constantly. She couldn't stop it. Frank Butler entered the tent. "Ready, Annie?" "As always," she replied. But she was lying. She had never felt so unprepared. On stage, Buffalo Bill made the announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, the legendary Annie Oakley." Applause rose. Annie took a breath. She tried to control her hands. "Calm down," she said to herself. "You're Annie Oakley. You can do this." But her hands weren't listening. They continued to shake. Annie came on stage. 3,000 people were standing and applauding. Eyes were on her. First target, a plate 25 meters away. Annie's easiest shot. She could do it with her eyes closed. She raised her gun. The audience fell silent. Annie took aim, but her hand was shaking. The target looked blurry. She couldn't focus. She pulled the trigger. The bullet found the target, but not the center. The audience still applauded because she had hit the target. But Annie knew this wasn't enough. Annie Oakley hit the center, always. Now she had hit the edge. The second target was prepared. 50-meter distance, a more difficult shot. Annie took a deep breath. She tried to calm her hands, but the shaking wouldn't stop. She made the second shot. This time she completely missed the target. The bullet disappeared into the air. The audience was shocked. Annie Oakley doesn't miss. This was impossible. Annie looked around in panic. Her hands were shaking even more now. She couldn't control them. Buffalo Bill approached the stage. "Annie, is everything all right?" "Yes," she lied. The third target was prepared. This time a moving target, Annie's signature shot. But her hands were shaking so much she couldn't take aim. The target looked blurry. The audience was waiting curiously. This was her most famous shot, the shot she never missed. Annie knew either she would make this shot or her career would end. Annie raised her gun. The target was swinging left and right, her hands shaky, focus blurred. The audience held its breath. 3,000 people were waiting for Annie's miracle, but there was no miracle. The shot went completely wide. It passed by the target. Silence fell. Then murmurs began. Annie Oakley missed. Annie stood on stage. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, her eyes filled with tears. In her 30-year career, she had never missed so many times. She had never felt so helpless. Buffalo Bill came beside her. "Annie, rest a bit. I'll handle this." But Annie knew this wasn't something that would pass with rest. This was permanent. Annie returned to her tent. She sat down and began to cry. The confidence she had built up for 30 years had crumbled. Frank came beside her. "Annie, what's happening?" Annie showed her hands. "They're shaking, Frank. I can't stop them. I can't aim like I used to." Frank held her hands. "It might be temporary. You're just tired." But Annie knew the truth. This was aging, the body's betrayal. "Frank, if I'm Annie Oakley, it's because I make perfect shots. But I can't do that anymore. Then who am I?" The question hung in the air. There was no answer. Annie was losing her identity, and this was worse than death. That night, Annie couldn't sleep. She sat in her tent. She looked at her guns. For 30 years, they had been friends. They had never betrayed her. But now her hands were betraying her. "Maybe it's time to retire," she thought. But this thought made her even sadder. Annie Oakley couldn't retire, because Annie Oakley only existed on stage. The next morning, Annie made a different decision. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't run away. She would go on stage again, but this time differently. She told Frank, "I'm going out again tonight. But this time I'll be honest." Frank didn't understand. "What do you mean?" Annie explained. "I'll tell the audience the truth, that my hands are shaking, that I'm not like I used to be." Frank was shocked. That would be career suicide. Your legend would end. Annie smiled. "The legend already ended, Frank. Now it's time to see the real Annie." That evening, Annie came on stage again. Again, thousands of spectators. Again, expectations. But this time, Annie began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you something." The audience was shocked. Annie Oakley never spoke. She only shot. "Last night, my hands were shaking, and I missed several shots. Because I'm 45 years old now, my body is changing. I'm not as perfect as I used to be, but I'll still do my best for you." The audience listened silently. This was something they hadn't expected, but it was sincere. Annie raised her gun. Her hands were still shaking, but she wasn't hiding it anymore. She made the first shot. She hit the target, but not the center. The audience still applauded, because now they weren't just seeing the shot. They were seeing the struggle. They were seeing her humanity. Throughout the night, Annie made shots. Some were good, some were bad, but the audience applauded at every shot, because they saw Annie's courage, the courage to accept weakness. This was more powerful than perfection. This was humanity. When the show ended, the audience gave a standing ovation. Annie was shocked. This had been the longest applause. A spectator shouted, "You're still Annie Oakley, but now you're more real." Annie understood. Perfection had made her a legend, but humanity had made her beloved. Months passed. Annie's hands were still shaking, but she was no longer ashamed of it. She explained this in her performances. She normalized aging. She taught the power of showing weakness. Audiences began to love her more, because now she was one of them, not perfect, but real. That day, Annie Oakley learned the greatest strength is accepting weakness. The greatest courage is being real. Her hands were shaking, but her spirit had never been stronger. because real power lies not in perfection, but in accepting imperfection. And Annie Oakley had finally become the real Annie.